Okay, this is Project Herpetoculture. Forget the number. So the general idea here with this particular episode is this is going to be a Uromastyx deep dive. So I'm going to try my best to take all of you, anyone listening, from basic foundation of zero all the way to having enough information to either care for a Euro that you have or that you're getting, or to have more information about Uromastyx in general. It's also going to be, hopefully, will be of use to not just a beginner, but someone who's deeply interested in Uromastyx generally. I'm going to try to get through this relatively quickly, but there is a lot to cover. So I may pause from time to time to think. I may repeat myself accidentally or intentionally just to emphasize things that I feel are necessary. And then, hopefully I'm going to get through information and like natural history, things like this. I'm going to get through basic care, breeding, information, just tons of stuff here. But I'm also going to cover a very long list of questions that I gathered from all of you. So all of this is going to be in here. Some basic background here. The majority of the technical and ecological information is going to be from this book, right? This is what I would call the holy grail of Uromastyx books. This is by Thomas Wilms. He's the man. And this book forms the basic foundation of most of what I do. Obviously, there's going to be some differences and some things that I'll mention that are different here and there. I'll mention when information comes from this book. I'll mention when information comes from any of the other sources like wild papers and whatnot, field studies. And then all of this information either can be found here in the book or on my website. I have a resources page that has links to various papers. So I'll just do my best to cover everything I can here. So thank you, everyone, for supporting the work that I do, whether you support me just by listening or whether you're on my Patreon. So just appreciate everybody. So let's just get right into this. Okay, so this is going to be, we're going to start with Uromastyx as a description and sort of where they come from and this whole thing. So Uromastyx are a small to large sized, mostly herbivorous desert lizard. They are relatively smooth-scaled, triangular heads, or actually sort of spade-shaped heads. So their heads are shaped a little bit like a shovel. They have a little bit of a beak at the front of their mouth. They don't have, all their teeth are lodged into the jaw. And so this will come into play later when we talk about some of their diet and sort of what they're evolved to use those beaks, those beak-like formations on the front of their mouths for. They have the sort of the key feature of Uromastyx that everyone loves to note is their spiky, spiny tails. And this can be everything from a small paddle shield-shaped tail on, say, a Uromastyx thomasi or Tomasi, however you like to pronounce that, with small plated spines on it, all the way to Uromastyx princeps, which have sort of almost like an explosion of spines coming off the tail, very large, long spines coming off that tail, sort of reminiscent of Cacrix defensor, if you're familiar. Uromastyx, generally speaking, range in size from as small as about 8 inches, 7 or 8 inches, in some of the smaller examples of species, which would be princeps, small adult thomasi, macfidieni, and small ocelata can be quite small, but they can be a little larger than that too. But then they can range all the way up to your Egyptians. So you're going to have Uromastyx. I'll make a little list of species here, but you have your Egyptian complex. You've got your Uromastyx aegyptia, Uromastyx aegyptia microlepis, and Uromastyx aegyptia leptiani. These three large species get into the maximum range of about 32 inches. There have been rumors of 3-foot Egyptians of one variety or another. And while I don't doubt that they have the potential to reach that size, I have yet to ever see hard evidence of one that's actually 36 inches. The largest one I've ever seen legitimate like measurements and metrics on was a 32-inch individual, and that's pretty big. So that's like the general size range. They can range in color from anything from a drab elephant gray, in the case of a classic Egyptian Uromastyx, all the way to bright red or yellow in the case of Uromastyx jri or nigroventris or acanthanura, all the way to or used to be acanthanura, all the way to like vibrant blues and greens in ornata and filbii and a handful of these others. Uromastyx currently contains about 15 species, and then some of them are divided by subspecies, but the basic species are Acanthanura, Aegyptia, Alfred Schmidti, Bentai, Dispar, Jri, Macfiddieni, Nigroventris, Occidentalis, Ocellata, Ornata princeps, Shabraki, Thomasi, and Yemenensis. Actually, that list is a little bit messed up because Shabraki might be under Yemenensis. I don't recall here specifically, but within that you have a handful of subspecies: Dispar maliensis, Dispar flavofasciata, Dispar. You have the Egyptian subspecies that I had mentioned previously. I've never seen what an Occidentalis looks like. I think they're identified from a holotype. I don't think they are out there anymore, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So these are all great. Some of these are super interesting. So these range all the way from Morocco in North Africa, across that northern part of Africa into the Middle East, in Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and then through into Saudi Arabia, and then in Iran and Iraq, and then India and Pakistan. There was a split proposed by Thomas Williams in 2009 to split the individuals that used to be classified as Uromastyx in Iran, Iraq, India, and Pakistan, and they changed it to SARA. So that's SARA loricata, Asmusi, and Hardwickii, or Hardwickii. The loricata is the Iranian, the Asmusi is the Iraqi, and the Hardwickii is the Pakistani and Indian Uromastyx. These used to be Uromastyx, but in 2009 they were split into SARA, and all of this is great stuff. So now that we've discussed a little bit about what a Uromastyx is, and sort of where they come from, I forgot to mention they are high desert animals. So visually, one might imagine sort of the Mojave Desert in Arizona as sort of a climatic allegory to where what Uromastyx experience in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, it's not a perfect one-to-one because Uromastyx have a massive range in which a lot of different environments and things are encompassed, but generally speaking, these are high desert diurnal animals. It's worth taking this moment to discuss a little bit of their history and their importation history in the trade. Not like a full history, but just generally, little bit of information. The CITES trade documents show substantial historic exports of specifically Uromastyx jri, for example, from Niger from 2001 to 2003. There was about 16,000 based on these documents that were exported. And then but before this, in the 90s and into the early 2000s, Uromastyx importation was really sporadic. I mean, it's always been sporadic, but during that particular time frame, the 90s and the early 2000s, the importation was not just sporadic, but it was sort of mixed up. All of the descriptions of what was landing, what we thought they were, people thought they were one species, and turns out there were multiple species in a single shipment, and there were some questions about identification. Some of the individuals who were working here in the United States at that time, who were a big influence on work I do now, would be Douglas Dix and Lindsay Pike, Douglas Dix was Deer Fern Farms, and Lindsay Pike was Eurotopia, I believe. So yes, Eurotopia, and they would document all of these shipments coming in and going to handpick out animals and finding, well, these are clearly two different species of Euro in one shipment. So there was a lot of like problem solving to be done. On top of this, methodology in herpetoculture hadn't been worked out for Uromastyx specifically to the extent that it has today. So there was a relatively low success rate with most of what was brought in. So there are huge numbers of Uromastyx species that we no longer have access to here in the United States, but have landed here before, such as Uromastyx acanthinura, what were formerly called the Algerian leopard Uromastyx. These are effectively a Moroccan Uromastyx, but this is black and white. And they are no longer available here, although they have made it to the United States at least once. Same thing with Uromastyx macfaddieni. And then, there's a handful of Uromastyx benti that have ended up like actual Omani benti that had ended up in one or two collections across the U.S., but all of them have either passed away or are too old to be, they've just been here for too long. So all of this to say that the import trade and import into the United States of Uromastyx has been really sporadic, not consistent, and each shipment could be wildly different from the other. So you could get some shipments that came in phenomenal condition and animals seemed to settle and do well. And then you get other shipments in which where the animals were in really, really rough condition and did not transition well into the United States. So there's some blessing on some level to quality, low number importation. This would offer dedicated breeders, access to founder stock for long-term populations here in the United States and elsewhere. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen that often. And whether that is due to lack of commitment on the end of some keepers, not a fault on their part, but just something that happens, as well as poor luck in getting the animals settled and established indoors can be challenging sometimes. So you put all of this together, and basically a good rule of thumb is that 99.9% of all Uromastyx in the trade in the United States are wild caught. That number is changing a little bit. Breeders such as myself, Joshua Marquis, Nicholas Alexander, and a handful of other people working really diligently with this genus are making it more common for Uromastyx to be produced to be captive bred and available to the general public. But part of the reason this is worth noting is because many of the outlets that sell these wild-caught Uromastyx label them as captive bred. Now, I don't want to call anyone out in particular. I'm not trying to say this person did anything bad or whatever, but there's reasons that people would label the otherwise wild-caught animals as captive bred. Some of the more cynical rationale leans on, it's just easier to make a sale. It's misleading. But the less cynical and more kind of understanding and sort of charitable view is that oftentimes, in order to get imported in the first place, animals sort of have to be labeled as captive bred in some cases. It's not always the case with Euros, but sometimes they have to be labeled captive bred in order to even get through customs. Okay, the problem is there are no major breeders outside in the ranges that these Uromastyx come from. There are claims of farm bred Uromastyx, and there's even footage you can find occasionally online of very large plots of land that are walled in or fenced in or what have you that contain a lot of Uromastyx. But this is not what people think of when they're thinking of a farm-bred animal in a traditional sense. These are either holding facilities for otherwise wild-caught animals before they're shipped out, or these are walled off areas of habitat in which wild Euros are pulled out from that penned in area. But it doesn't make them farm bred. It makes them a wild caught animal still. And they still end up with some of the same issues and problems that, an otherwise labeled wild caught animal would have. I've never seen solid, hard evidence for an actual Uromastyx farm anywhere. If there is one, I'd love to see it, but I haven't seen it yet. And it's usually nonsense. It's usually just a way of getting them through and making it seem more legitimate and a little more ethical. And then the way this ends up on our end is, an importer will bring in say 500 captive bred or farm bred ornate Uromastyx, and then what happens is they redistribute those animals to reptile shops and sales outlets across the country. And because they were already labeled as captive bred to get into the country in the first place, these places will sort of follow that norm and say, oh yeah, these are captive bred. But they don't actually have any evidence of them being captive bred. The other reason that it would be, actually, let me rephrase that. There are also really, really common stories and narratives that I hear every single day from people all across the US who say, I bought my Euro from this particular shop or this particular seller online, and he's captive bred, and here's the thing, but they're having a problem with him. And I say, well, listen, your Uromastyx is likely wild caught. And they say, no, the store sold him as captive bred. It said captive bred on the tank. The thing is, there's no governing body or oversight commission that says, yes, this is legitimately captive bred, and you can put it on your labels, right? There's no governing body for this. So people put it on there and say it anyway. When people press for evidence and say, okay, well, who's the breeder? They might be told by the store something like, oh, it was we got it from a local breeder. And then when pressed, say, well, who's the local breeder? Oh, well, they prefer to remain anonymous, or we'll get you the information at some point, and then they never do. All of this is designed to keep you asking, to try to get you to ask fewer questions as a buyer. Okay. Uromastyx are difficult to breed. And so if you can breed them, you're probably going to document it and show it off. And if you can breed them and you do successfully produce them, you're not going to sell them to a pet store, because pet stores have to pay wholesale on their animals in order to make a profit when they resell them. So you would never no breeder would sell their hard-won captive bred babies to a local shop at a loss unless they had a very special relationship with that pet shop. Maybe they're friends with the owners or something. But in this case, they will be very transparent about sharing, anytime my local shops get any animals from me, which is rare, extremely rare, but it happens from time to time. And when they do, they are totally, you can say it's mine, and the animal can come from me, and you can tell people that it came from me, and that they can contact me if they have any questions. Like, that's what a responsible breeder is doing. They're not wholesaling large numbers of Uromastyx to a pet shop at a cut rate. It's just not how it goes. So now it's worth noting that this is not an indictment of importation, right? Some importation is necessary on some level, so that way we can get good amounts of founding stock for a particular set of animals. But the main thing to understand here is that whether wild caught or captive bred, the animals deserve a good life and deserve a loving home. So if you happen to have a wild caught Euro, that's totally okay. It's just worth knowing this is going to inform how you care for them going forward into your time with that animal. It's going to you're going to probably be more likely to take them to the vet right away. They're very likely to be having a problem. They might have damage on the body, scars from being bitten, or they might be underweight from the importation process. There's probably stressed. I mean, there's so much to have in your mind there that makes a really big difference if you have a wild caught animal versus a captive bred animal. This is a big deal. So obviously, generally speaking, my main recommendation for anyone out there, I understand if you want an animal right now, okay? It is very well worth it to be patient, to take your time, and to find a really high quality breeder and buy from them, even if it takes you a year or two to get an animal. It's so well worth it. They live a long time. It's just going to be great for you if you give them give it the time, give it the patience that you need, and give that patience to a breeder who is dedicating themselves to creating a great pet and a great future for this work that we all care about. All right, let's get into a basic quick start care guide. So I'm going to give a rundown here of a basic setup, and it's going to apply to as many things as I can. I'm going to make some changes and adjustments where I can. And this is going to be designed to get you, if you're at zero, if you don't know how to set up or care for a Euro, this is going to give you that base. A bit's basically going to be a quick start. And just note that for my full care philosophy and all the nuances, you can find all of this in much more detail on my care guide, which is on my website. It's also on YouTube as like a verbal, like an audible type care guide. And then this podcast also will be super informative. Okay, so basic starting enclosure for the majority of species that are going to be available here in the U.S. pet trade is going to be a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot framework for a basic adult Uromastyx. Now, there's going to be some variance there. Okay, so if you have some of the larger species like the banded Uromastyx, Uromastyx dispar flavifasciata, the Mali Uromastyx, Uromastyx dispar maliensis, the Moroccan Uromastyx, Uromastyx nigroventris, these 3 species are going to need larger enclosures because they get larger at end size. Some of those species can get as big as like 18 inches long, huge Euros. Okay, so they're going to need a 6 foot long by 2 or 3 feet wide by 2 foot high enclosure. Okay, some of the other species such as Ornata, Filbii, Princeps, Yemenensis, Ocellata, these are excellent climbers. And so if you could go for a 4 by 2 by 3 foot high, or even 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet cube, or you could even go more extreme, have a 3 by 3 base and 4 or 5 foot high enclosures. As long as the heat gradient is set properly, those animals that are climbers would love that vertical space to explore. There's an excellent keeper, I believe he's in Oregon, Dean. A great guy. He's a Lizard Cabinet on Instagram, and he has these brilliant tall enclosures set up for many of his species that he custom built himself. And I would encourage people to go check those out as a great example of how you can get creative with what the framework of a Uromastyx enclosure can look like. Okay, for brand new Uromastyx, now let's just say you got a baby from me. You got a baby Uromastyx from me. Either I shipped it to you or at a local show or whatever. I would actually encourage most of you, if the animal is younger than a year, or a little bit younger than a year, I would encourage you for that. This is new. This is a new development for me, but I've been encouraging people that for that first 5-6 months, keep them in a slightly smaller enclosure than you might otherwise. So this could be a 40-gallon breeder glass tank. This could be like a paludarium style, like Exoterra glass enclosure. This could be a smaller custom enclosure. This could be a 55-gallon Rubbermaid tote that you're using as like a brooder. I think that at first, when that animal transitions to a new home, keeping them in a slightly smaller but still adequate space-wise enclosure can help you as you're learning the quirks of that animal and learning to get to know that individual Uromastyx and getting all your parameters right for your location and your space. I now think that it's a great idea to start a little small. This will also allow you to plan properly and plan accordingly for your large final enclosure. Now, if you want to do your large final enclosure first, it's totally fine, and the animal is going to do great in that enclosure. Okay, so that's the baseline for size of enclosure. Now let's talk about lighting and temperature. Okay, so these are bright diurnal high desert reptiles. So bright, hot lighting. Okay, we're going to look for a basking zone temperature. So, when I say basking zone, I'm not talking about a small point. I'm talking about a large area inside the enclosure, right, that can fit the animal's entire body, that reaches 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, now this temperature range, the reason I give a range of temperatures and not a specific temperature is because each Uromastyx is an individual, and they're going to have very slightly differing preferences about the temperature that they prefer at the hottest and the temperature they prefer at the lowest. So by having a 10-degree range, that gives you the flexibility to adjust as you see fit. If your animal is avoiding the major big part of the basking zone for an extended period of time, well, that might tell you that that spot on the basking zone is too hot. You might have to drop it by a few degrees. Okay. If the animal is staying close to that hottest part of the basking zone and like hugging the rock and staying there and not moving, not being as active, your temperatures are probably too cool. So you might want to bump them up a little bit. Okay. This is the basking zone. Your ambient warm side temperature should be 95 to 105. And your ambient cool side temperature during the day should be about 85 to 90. Okay. Give or take a few degrees in either direction. During nighttime, lights go off. Okay, so you want to have lights. You can just have your lights mirror the sunrise sunset cycles in your local area. Doesn't matter where you are. Even if you're in high north latitudes, you have short days in the winter. That's okay too. Or latitudes, longitudes. I can't remember. But anyway, you want to have, roughly speaking, a 12 to 14 hour light cycle in the spring and summer months, and then you can cut that down if you want. You don't have to, but if you want, you can cut that lighting photo period down to about 8 to 10 hours during the winter. Okay, you don't have to bring it down if you don't want to, but you can. Okay, you want to have a bright, full spectrum, high powered UVB lighting. Okay, so for me, this looks like currently I'm using Reptile Systems Zone 4 UVB bulbs. This is an excellent brand. I also use their eco halogens for my basking lights. Before I talk a little bit about why I like those lights, let me just mention that any brand that you can get, so if it doesn't matter if it's Reptile Systems, Exoterra, Zoomed, all of them, Arcadia, they all make a good product that, as long as you're buying sort of like the highest powered UVB lighting that you can for your Uromastyx, it's going to be adequate, okay? Make sure you replace your UVB light regularly because the UV output degrades on them. So just follow the instructions on the packaging that come in the bulb. Also follow the instructions on that packaging in the bulb for distance, the distance you want from the UVB light to where the animal is basking, because you don't want it to be too close because that can get dangerous. And you don't want to be too far away because you can lose power there. So you're going to look for a sweet spot in terms of distance on the UVB light. With your basking lights, a very common question I get is, what wattage do you recommend for this size enclosure or whatever? And this is really difficult to give, mostly because everything is going to affect your temperature, from your ventilation to what the basking surface is made of, to what the cage material is made of, to how far away the bulb is from the basking platform, everything. So when you're trying to figure out your lighting and what bulbs to get, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have a range of halogens, a range of different basking bulbs of somewhere between 3 to 5 bulbs of various wattages, so that way you can figure out what combination, because you're usually going to need a combination of 2 bulbs. Okay, a lot of people might be able to, I can get away with like 1 or 2 basking bulbs per enclosure because I have so many enclosures, the space heats up a lot. But if you have just one Uromastyx, you might need 2 or 3 basking lights to like really get that temperature range and gradient the way you need it to be. Okay, so you're going to want about 3 to 5 different bulbs of about 3 to 5 different wattages, go from 50 to 100 watt, right? And be willing to make adjustments both based on peak daytime temperatures and time of year, because it gets cooler in winter and warmer in the summer. So you might be able to drop your wattage in the summer and increase your wattage in the winter if need be. So you're going to want to have a range of wattages to use to get your basking set. Okay, so that's your basking and that's your UVB. Supplemental lighting, if you can add it, right? LED bars. Just added incandescent and fluorescent bulbs just to add more light into the cage. The brighter, the better. Okay. Let's talk about substrate now. Okay. So your substrate, this is a super common, can be controversial in herpetoculture, which it shouldn't be. Let me get one thing out of the way here, two things out of the way right away when we're talking about substrate. Okay, so the two things that are worth noting. The first is that there are substrates that are actually lethal to your animal. Okay, it's not sand. Sand is not going to be lethal. Okay, the lethal substrates are ones like crushed walnut or shredded cork, like ground cork blend beddings, things like this. These I have seen in many different occasions. Those substrates get ingested intentionally or unintentionally by many species of reptile and then die as a result of legitimate impaction. Okay, but natural substrates, sand, gravel, cypress mulch, topsoil, all of these things, these are totally safe for Uromastyx of any size, quite frankly, to be housed on. Okay, all you're really going to be looking for is very low dust. You want to choose your substrates that have very low dust. So unfortunately, this eliminates many of the manufactured substrates, you might say. Like, so let's take as excavator clay or stone desert. These substrates have their purpose, but as a loose bedding for Uromastyx, they're going to be way too dusty. So I don't really use those here anymore. I personally make a blend that's a mixture of two different types of gravel and one type of sand. They're all different. So there's quarries are different all over the country in terms of where this stuff comes from. So you can use any of these beddings, but I really like a mix of some sort of simple low dust play sand mixed with a low dust pea gravel of some kind. And that can be any mix, ranging from pure sand to pure gravel and anything in between. You can mix topsoil in if you wish. You can mix cypress mulch in if you wish. All of it's going to be about your preference, how easy or difficult it is to clean, how dusty it is, and then what you have access to. So don't feel like you have to get one perfect thing. Just know that there's a lot of different substrates that you can choose. Sani chips works. I've seen Uromastyx raised and bred on Sani chips, and it works just fine. So there's lots of different things you can use as a substrate. Okay. Now, do you need to make enough to hold a burrow? My stance is that it's not required. You can, if you wish, offer enough burrowing space. Just know that it's going to make finding your Euro difficult when you may need to find them. Okay, so they can burrow. Some species, like the Moroccans and some of these bigger ones, like they'll burrow like crazy if they have that space. But you can also offer like false tunnels, overturned PVC and roofing tiles. You can offer humid hides, which is like a sort of like a modified nesting box, which we'll talk about later in the breeding section. All of these are totally fine to offer, but not required. You can just have a few inches of loose bedding. Okay, make sure that anytime you put loose bedding down and you add furnishings into the cage for animals of any size, you got to be very careful to set those in pieces of furniture like rocks and logs and stuff firmly on the ground underneath the substrate. Okay, so this is to make sure that there's not like sand or dirt trapped underneath a rock, to the point where Uromastyx could dig out that sand when they're trying to dig around and look for a place to hide and have the rock or the furniture crush them. Okay, this happens from time to time, so you got to be very diligent and mindful of where you're placing furniture and making sure that it's stable and that it can't fall on or crush the animal. As far as hiding places and internal furniture goes, okay, so my recommendation for individuals is to look at wild photography of Uromastyx, which can be found all over the internet and YouTube and iNaturalist, and use what you see in the wild to inform the kind of furniture and landscapes you put inside your enclosures here in captivity. My preference is to use real stone, but you can use fake rocks and universal rock backgrounds and things like this. You can use all these different kinds of rock and faux rock and plastic rock and manufactured hides. All of it is totally okay to use, but you want to make sure that all these hides have great texture. The rocks have natural texture that the animals can grip and will naturally wear down their nails. Okay, but your manufactured hiding places won't do this. But they can still work as a great hiding place, and you can mix hiding places, like manufactured hides with stones, You can use tile, you can use slate, flagstone, roofing tile, just chunks of rock that you find out in the world, all of it, decomposed granite, mopani wood, grape wood, manzanita is another one that I love. Manzanita is great because it's thin but really stiff and stable, so it's great for climbing. The species that are better climbers love climbing on manzanita that's stacked real high and tall. So what you're looking to do is provide one sort of major center platform in the enclosure that's going to be your basking area, right? So your basking lights are going to sit right up above that main structure. You might have a few very small hiding places right underneath that basking structure. And when I say small hiding places, these big curved logs and some of these big hiding boxes that are made by various companies, these are much too big and much too open. Okay, Uromastyx are seeking very snug and very small shelters. This is what makes them feel safe. This is what makes them feel secure. So you want to be, even for an adult Uromastyx of many species, 1.5 inches or less is enough, and they will find a way in there. They're very good at compressing their bodies very flat. But you will need to adjust as your Uromastyx grows, and as they change, you'll need to adjust the furnishings and the interior parts of the enclosure to suit them and help make those hides more suitable for them as they grow. Okay, so this is, I like to minimize my hiding places on the cool end of the enclosure. I like to maximize them on the warm side of the enclosure. I am encouraging my animals to spend more of their time towards the warmer end, even in the winter, and even though I like giving them lots of choice. They still have places to hide on the cool end, but this is just a good way of, the more the better. Some of my enclosures have rocks and stacks that are set in such a way that one animal has like 25 different places to shelter. Okay, but 3 or 4 is also really good. So have that in your minds. All right, let's talk about diet and water. So generally speaking, I like to think about this in terms of percentages. 95% of my Uromastyx diet is greens. Okay, store-bought or grown and found wild plants and greens. Okay, so I'll mention a list of this in a minute, but I just want to get the percentages out here. So the vast majority of the diet is greens. From there, we can look at about 5% other. Okay, and so that 5% other might be various seed and legume mixes, like the Eurogrit that I'm making now. Seasonal blooms and flowers, like wildflowers and plants you can grow in your garden. And other mixed, like hard veggies and treats and things. So whether it's shredded squash, carrots, pumpkin, or insects, right? So mealworms, locusts. I do not feed crickets or roaches, or silkworms or hornworms or waxworms or any of those foods to my Uromastyx at all. The only insects they get are mealworms, superworms, and locusts, so actual grasshoppers. And I only give them in very small amounts and only during the warm seasons. So remember that, again, it's okay to give them the occasional insect, and we'll talk more about wild gut analysis and more of that. We'll talk about that more later in the podcast. But for now, I just want you to remember those percentages. I want you to remember 95% mostly greens, and then that 5% is going to be a mixture of all those other food sources, but it's going to be quite minimal. Okay, water and supplementation. So your water, you can offer a shallow water dish if you want, but most Uromastyx will get most of the moisture they need from their food. If you're ever worried about whether or not your Uromastyx is getting enough water, you can either offer them a bowl of water, you can give them a very short bath and soak, that's totally harmless and fine, or you can reduce the dry food that they're getting and increase the proportion of greens that they're getting in their diet. So if you can just neglect giving them any dry mixes or anything for a week or two, and all they get is just this moisture-rich food, that's okay too. It's a good way to up their hydration. Okay, supplement. I recommend any calcium and multivitamin supplement by any brand, and then follow the directions on that. That's the simplest way to say it. I personally will rotate through various supplements all the time. I've used mineral outdoor formula for 25 years for all my big diurnal baskers, all that. Really important to note here that all that high-powered UVB lighting that you're going to be using on a Uromastyx makes it so you're not really going to need the vitamin D3 supplementation in the diet. So you're looking for calcium without D3 when you're using super high-powered lighting. And then your multivitamin, again, any brand. Arcadia makes great stuff. Reptile Systems makes great stuff. Mineral makes a Vitol. That's great. And then follow the directions for use on that. Okay, so this is the best way to do that. Doesn't matter what supplement you use; they're all very good. Repashy makes excellent supplements. I've used those too. So any brand of supplement is fine. Just make sure you follow the directions on it. Okay, so that's the water and supplement. Let's talk about handling. Okay, so this is a pretty important one because Uromastyx all have excellent potential to be wonderful pets. Now, they sometimes, when, let's say, a captive bred baby changes homes, they go from the breeder to their new pet home. Very often, that change can startle them, and they might revert briefly back to a little bit of a skittish behavior. So let's just remember that Uromastyx, based on the way they evolved, these are high desert, diurnal herbivores. They have limited sheltering options and high levels of predation. Lots of predators in the areas in which they live. So it is advantageous and adaptive for a Uromastyx to be very shy and very skittish, and it's easy to break their trust. Okay. Remember, though, that Uromastyx have a very long and rich lifespan. So we'll talk about that later in the podcast as well. We'll talk about their lifespan. But for now, just know that they have a long lifespan, something that can range anywhere from about 15 to 55 years. I'll elaborate more in a minute. But because of that length of lifespan, anywhere from a few months to a couple of years of work to develop trust with your Uromastyx is nothing compared to their long lifespan. So even if you are desperate for a super tame, happy Euro, and you happen to get one that reverts back to a little bit of skittish behavior, this is okay. Just be patient, give them time to come around, use treats, so high-value foods like Eurogrit, or you can get like bee pollen granules, even though I don't feed any bee pollen granules to my Euros at all. Flowers are really good for this. Hand feeding to get them to come to you and understand that you're not a threat. And just be patient. Do this with them for a very, very long time. Learn to understand their body language, which we will also talk about later in the podcast. We'll talk a little bit about body language and that communication, because reptiles use their bodies as verbs. So as you grow to understand their body language and go at their pace, don't force them into any particular handling, that they don't want to be a part of, because this will just continue to break that trust with them over and over and over again. You're looking for that slow but steady increase in trust. It might look like the day you get your Euro, they run from you the second you come in the enclosure. But by the end of the first few weeks with that animal, maybe they don't run away. Maybe they stay and watch you while you walk around the room. And only if you come over to the enclosure do they bolt and run. But just give them time, give them lots of patience. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about longevity. And then reading body language. This is going to be I think this will be a good transition. We'll go from longevity and body language, and then we'll move from there into breeding. Okay, so and then we'll cover a lot more stuff after this. So starting with longevity, there are field notes and anecdotes that suggest an average of 20 to 25 years reported in captivity for many Uromastyx. This is probably quite low in terms of for many of the species. There are examples of, I believe the record for the longest lived Uromastyx is a Moroccan Uromastyx, Uromastyx nigroventris, that was imported as an adult and into, I think, either a Dutch or a German zoological institution, that died after something like 50 years in that zoo. So that should indicate that's probably not an outlier, right? Like if the average was 20 to 25 years and one lived 50, that would be ridiculous. So if you have animals, even if a 50-plus-year-old Uromastyx is an outlier, then that means you could reasonably expect 40 years out of the same species for an outlier on the other end, perhaps, right? So my guess is that the larger species like Moroccans, Bandeds, Mollies, and Egyptians, they probably all have lifespans that into the 50, 60 range. Okay, so this is probably the case. Some of these smaller species, we're looking at probably somewhere in that 15 to 30, depending on the species, right? So it might lean towards 15 or 20 for small ones like Princeps, Thomasi, Ocellata, and then it might range into that 20 to 30-ish range for Ornata, Philbii, Yemenensis, some more medium-sized J-Rye, some of those species, right? So it's probably what we're looking at there. The reality is that other than we have field studies, right? So I know that in the Wilms book, he cites there's an Egyptian that has a collar that's like 20 some years old, and it's mentions in the book, it's still a member of a breeding population. So for all those biology nerds out there, usually your longevity is tied to your breeding lifespan. Obviously, it's not the way in humans, but that's a totally different topic. But with most animals, their lifespan and their breeding span are tied together. So if you have an Egyptian Uromastyx that's in its mid to late 20s in the wild and still a member of a breeding population, that means they probably have a very long breeding life ahead of them, because there's no evolutionary advantage to them outliving their ability to breed. Unlike with more social animals where there's a lot of benefit. You increase the survival rate of your offspring by having grandparents that don't breed anymore themselves, but they help you and help you take care of your kids and things like that. Okay, so with Uromastyx, my guess is that the smaller species, again, they're going to range from that 15 to 20, 25. Then you're going to have those medium range species, which range from about 20 to 30, 35. And then you're going to have those upper range species that probably range from like 35 to 55, somewhere in that ballpark in terms of longevity. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about body language. After we'll get into some more diet specific stuff like wild plant ideas to use, early illness signs. We'll talk about hurdles in my work, how my philosophy's changed, what could make Euros more popular. We'll talk about morphs, hybrids, the future, all of this stuff. I want to talk a little bit about body language, and then we'll get into breeding after that, because I think all of this stuff is just there's like I think going in this particular order is really, really useful. Okay, so reading your body language. So there's some of a Uromastyx. So there's some general lizard stuff that should be obvious to most people. Okay, hissing, tail whipping. The famous Uromastyx famously do the hula, right, where they do an S curve with their body, and then they'll hiss, and then they'll be ready to whip you with their tail. This is a pissed off lizard. Okay, what you're looking for is to bring them. You're always looking to pull them out of those states of high stress. Doesn't mean that stress isn't a good thing from time to time, but you're looking to reduce stress overall. So you're looking for making sure that your animal is not frantic and skittish crazy in its movements. Now, obviously, if you're just taming the animal down, that's okay. It's normal for them to be skittish. But if you have an animal that is otherwise tame and you see them running and ripping around the enclosure and seeming frantic, well, then that might indicate to you that something's not quite right, that they're not quite settled or feel comfortable in their space. Okay? Normally, we think about the extremes of these animals. So it's either relaxing, chilling out on a rock. Maybe they're throwing a sexy leg out there, that one extension on a leg. Their eyes are half closed. They're clearly sleeping and comfortable. Okay? And then the other far end of that is the hula, hissing, tail whipping Uromastyx. Okay? So we're looking to get... We want them to express that full range of their body languages and behaviors, but we really want to maximize the amount of time that they're in a comfortable space in their enclosure and in their interactions with you. So learning to see when their body posture is tense and stressed out, learning to understand when it's a little more relaxed and calm. This is all going to help you also notice when things seem a little bit weird, right? So this is all part and parcel to being able to catch early signs of illness and problems, because if you get familiar with the animal, you'll get more familiar with when something seems wrong and weird. Okay. So let's talk about breeding and my workflow here. All right. So this will hopefully accompany my YouTube series on this. So for those who have asked, I have only Breeding Uromastyx Part 1 of 3 on YouTube right now. I'm still working on filming and editing and getting everything down for Part 2 and 3. I don't have an ETA on that yet, but for now, my care guide, which has a breeding section on it now, and this podcast will serve as most of the information for breeding that I have out in the world right now on Uromastyx. But just know that those are coming. Okay, so let's start with breeding by saying breeding Uromastyx is. I say that it's not as difficult as it might seem from the outset. I think that there are a few primary things that can set you up for success, and that's what I'm going to cover here. I will talk a little bit about why some of these, if you don't follow some of these guides, where you can get some pitfalls, okay? But I also just want to encourage anyone listening to say, if you have any interest in it at all, you should probably try to breed your Euros. We need more people working with them. As it stands right now, even some of the most established species in U.S. herpetoculture, namely ornates and J-Rye, only have a few people holding up their place in United States herpetoculture. So we still desperately need people to take this up, so that way we can have a diverse set of individuals going forward into the future. So that way people who love these animals in 150 years can keep them. Okay, so I encourage all of you to give it a try. One of the main pillars of success in breeding in Uromastyx is going to be to purchase captive bred young Uromastyx. Okay, so start with truly captive bred young healthy Euros. Okay, so you're going to want to seek out a good quality breeder who has a sufficient number of animals where they can get you unrelated animals, or you can buy your founding stock from multiple breeders who all have unrelated stock, so that way you can have unrelated stock in what you do. It is unwise to start with adults. Okay, it's not wrong. It's not wrong. It's totally fine. Sometimes people do it. I've done it myself. Occasionally, you will find an opportunity to get adult animals that are still in good enough form and that can breed and can teach you a little bit about how to do it. But the reason I don't like doing that is mostly for two primary concerns. The first being, I don't know how those animals were raised. Okay, they might look outwardly healthy, but if I don't know for sure how those animals were raised from day to day throughout their life, then I might be the unfortunate recipient of the downstream problems that were related to their poor care before they came to me. And I don't want to take that risk, okay? The second primary concern with getting adult animals is going to be the length of time that it takes them to establish and transition into a new home. So in my experience, if you bring in adult animals, whether wild caught or captive bred, doesn't really matter. You bring them into a new home, those animals tend to need 1 full year of cycle in that new space to effectively and successfully reproduce in that new environment. Okay, so in other words, if you were to bring in an adult pair of animals in early spring and they have to ship from one place to another, you bring them in spring, they seem to settle just fine. They mate, they lay eggs. What happens? The eggs don't hatch, or they die one by one the eggs die one by one, or the eggs were not good in the first place, or the female had issues laying her eggs. My current working hypothesis is that this is the result of a too high of a baseline level of stress from the transition to successfully reproduce. I've seen this happen countless times in my own early days and in many, 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 many people since then who did not take this advice and run with it. Okay, so very, very careful about this. I try to get, if I'm going to get new breeding stock and they happen to be adults, or wild caught animals, I try to get them in early spring, and I do not breed them. I let them go through spring and summer without breeding. Then they go down for the winter. They come up in the spring, and then by that next spring, they're ready to breed, and they've seen the way things work here. Their stress is low enough. Okay, so this is starting with healthy captive bred offspring that you've raised yourself, that know you and your environment and your local temps. This is going to set you up for success. The second thing that's going to set you up for success in breeding Uromastyx is going to be keeping your Uromastyx 100% solo for the majority of the year. Okay, so I want to elaborate on this particular topic because it's one that I'll experience pushback on from time to time. So, sorry, I had to take a drink. I probably should slow down just a little bit. All right, so solo housing and why I think it's so important. In my experience, both in attempting to keep my animals together, as well as in watching other people who insist on keeping their animals together, I have noticed that usually you can get a couple of decent seasons. You might be able to get, at best, in best case scenarios, you might get a couple of seasons of good reproduction out of a pair of Uromastyx if they're forced to stay together year round. But inevitably what happens is there is a lot of aggression that can come up between Uromastyx because they come from such a harsh desert environment that the base conjecture is that the reason they are territorial is because in such a harsh place, there's only so many resources that one animal can garner in a specific space in the desert. So by pushing others outside of a territory, that territory size is sufficient to sustain one animal. So it makes sense for them to push each other out of that space so they can survive and move on. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't interact with one another. This doesn't mean that they don't encounter each other in the wild. But in the wild, there's the notable distinction that if the animal wants to flee and get away from the other, they can do it. And in herpetoculture, indoors, they do not have that option. Okay? I have watched animals that are housed together. I've watched one animal insistently chase down and beat the living shit out of their cage mate. Okay? And it doesn't matter how far or where that animal goes, they cannot sufficiently get away from them. You know? Even if you're not breeding Uromastyx, my suggestion to you is to keep your animal solo, and you can do supervised periodic visits. Because, of course, complete social isolation is not what we want either. That's not good for them either. We're not trying to put them in solitary confinement. So, there's other reasons for keeping them solo here, too, that are sort of ethical, right? If I'm keeping one animal per enclosure, I have less transmission of disease from one enclosure to another because there's fewer animals in each individual space. I have a closer read on what that individual animal is doing. If I have two animals in one cage, unless I'm watching both of them all the time, I might not be able to know which one is eating a little more, which one is getting a little bit less. Right? If every animal is housed individually, I know who ate the food. If I put it in the morning and I come home and it's gone, I know who ate the food. I know who defecated. I know how often they defecated. I know who's basking and who's not. Right? This is really important because when they're together in an enclosure, you can't keep as close of track on this. Okay? Uromastyx can kill one another with their aggression. I've had it happen to me, and it's really, really hard to deal with. You don't want them hurting one another, okay? So you want them interacting, and you want them being social and being able to interact with members of their own species. But you want to do this in supervised, short bursts to reduce the total amount of stress on the animals because they are naturally territorial. All of that said, there are a lot of people who disagree with me on this. There are a lot of people who think that it is totally fine to house their animals together. I know at least two other breeders who do it that way, who have success in breeding, and they're great people. I respect and admire them very much. But even both of those individuals have noted that they have open, empty cages all the time to have to split animals that are beating one another up and fighting and not getting along, especially as babies. Okay, so especially as babies, because it can be very high, much higher consequence with babies than adults sometimes. Okay, so I still think that long term, my hope is that in 50 years, the majority of people are keeping Uromastyx mostly solo, or that we have perhaps molded them through selective breeding to be a little bit more tolerant of one another and less less aggressive. But I don't see that happening. Okay, so at any rate, now, so we have these are the two foundational pillars of breeding success: is purchasing captive bred animals and being purchasing captive bred animals and keeping the animals solo. So let's get into a little bit of the process of breeding. So you have your animals that you want to breed. They've gone through a few seasons in your house. You raised them perhaps, or maybe they're adults that you raised and let them go through a year of being in your house before you try to breed them. Okay? Breeding starts in fall. Okay, and what I mean by that is in fall, in most places, we get a drop in temperature. Okay, this can be quite extreme, say in Canada, or quite mild, say in Phoenix, Arizona. But you're going to get this change with the seasons. Uromastyx are highly attuned to seasonal change and will readily adjust their behavior accordingly. So to cycle your Uromastyx, there's several different ways you can do this. Now, cycling them, putting them through a winter cooling period or a mild form of hibernation is thought to prepare them hormonally and physiologically for a breeding season. This would mimic winter in the wild. Animals would rest during the winter, recover, and then in the spring they would come up, build up their, get ready, get active, and then they would breed in the early spring. Babies would hatch in summer and have a long time to grow before their own first winter. Okay, so the idea that the winter is important for breeding success is well founded across many, many different reptile species. However, I don't think Uromastyx require a very, very hard cooling to successfully breed. I have tried every different which way of brumating my animals. I have done it the very extreme way, which is where I would fast them for 2 weeks and gradually lower their temperatures. After that 2 weeks, I'd put them in a cabinet, basically at cool temps, like in the 60s, with sand in their container, maybe a little bit of moisture, and just keep them cold, keep them there for eight weeks, and then pull them out in the spring. That worked great. That's a little harsh. I wouldn't do that anymore. I wouldn't recommend that particular cooling method anymore. Now, what I do mostly is all of my animals and all my Euros are in a space in which the ambient temperatures are dramatically affected by the seasons. So naturally in the fall, the temperatures drop in my room. The ambient daytime temperatures and the ambient nighttime temperatures all drop. They might drop by 5 to 10 degrees. Not much, but enough to make a difference to the animals. You'll see them stop coming out. They'll eat less. They'll defecate less. All of the above. This is totally normal. This is classic brumation. Okay, this is what you want. You can instigate this by dropping the light cycles, right? Reducing the total amount of time that the lights are on gradually in the fall and then bringing them up again in the spring. You can do this by, if you're keeping them outdoors somewhere, like in Phoenix, they're going to do this on their own. Okay, but this is the primer. This is how it starts. Brumation can be a little tricky for new reptile owners or people who haven't experienced a reptile that brumates really hard, because brumation tends to fly in the face of what we think of as healthy lizard behavior. But that tells us that we have to reframe our conceptions around what healthy lizard behavior looks like, and not that we have to change the way the animals brumate and cool. Okay, so you can do this. What I tend to do is I follow my animal's trajectory. If they start slowing down and cooling down, I'm going to let them brumate. But you can also instigate it for them by adjusting their temperatures and their lighting. All right. Now, here I have animals that will brumate from October, late September, early October, all the way to February and March. A very, very long time of inactivity, but they do great. I have some that only reduce their activity for a few weeks to a month or two at a time. I have animals that are in the middle of a brumation, but I would like them to start coming up from that. Maybe I felt like they've gone long enough and I'd like to get them working on the breeding season. I might increase their lighting, after 8 weeks of cooling. I might just naturally start kicking up the lighting and increasing the photo period to get them to come out. The reason I'm not being as prescriptive here is because there's many different ways to do this successfully, and it doesn't have to look one particular way for you to get success. I tend to lean on the hands-off, they know what they're doing approach, but some people like to be more hands-on and like to be more involved in everything that's happening with their animals. So I leave this to you to think about this as a basic framework for cooling. Now, what happens next is, after winter cooling has happened, either the animals started coming out on their own or you started increasing the temperatures to get them to come out more. All right. What you're going to see is individual animals will increase their activity. They'll increase their appetite. They'll do all the things. They'll start moving back towards more typical, healthy reptile behavior. Then what will happen is I will decide somewhere in that 2 weeks to a month after the animal's coming out of cooling or brumation, that's when I will start doing introductions for breeding. Basically all this means is sort of like a conjugal visit, right? So I take one of the animals in the pair and I introduce them to the other. It doesn't matter if you put the male into the female's enclosure or the female into the male's enclosure. I do both. I change it up every year. It does not matter. The only thing that sometimes I keep in my mind is if one of the members of that pair is especially skittish, I might not move that animal into the other's enclosure. I will usually prefer to take the one that is less skittish and flighty and put it in the enclosure with the animal that is more skittish and flighty, and then, pull them out after a few days, right? So, and what this is going to do is usually these introductions, I think of these as another turn on the dial to encourage the animals to breed. So again, as I said earlier, I think Uromastyx are best housed alone. I think if you want consistent breeding, housing your animals alone is the way to do it. Because then you have the whole suite of influences on that animal's behavior, pushing it towards breeding during the springtime when you want them to. So not only has that animal been primed by a quality health regime as they grew, that animal's also been primed by a good seasonal drop in the winter that was either engineered by you or the weather or both. But then what's going to happen is now temperatures are all coming up. There's more food that's more abundant. And I'm finding the animal's thinking to itself, well, and I found myself being introduced to members of the opposite sex. It must be breeding season, right? So this is all going to lead into telling them this is the time to do what you want to do. During these brief, supervised, I might add, breeding introductions between male and female animals, I will base the length of those interactions on the level of aggression between the animals. If the animals have a very aggressive reaction to one another, it's going to be a shorter introduction. Okay? If they have a very relaxed attitude to one another, I might also make it a short introduction and say, you're not feeling it enough, I'm going to split you guys up. Maybe, if they have a very relaxed interaction, but there's still breeding behavior between them, like the male does a bunch of push-ups and runs after the female, then that's fine too. You can do it for as short as 5 minutes to as many as a few days to let them get used to one another. I like to keep the introductions shorter early on because I feel like it helps act as an anticipatory mechanism for the animals. Okay, so what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to do short introductions every 2 or 3 days after about 2 to 4 weeks after cooling has ended. I'm going to start doing these brief introductions, and I will do that until the pair mates. Okay. Now, 99% of the time, because you're keeping your animals apart, if you're following my instructions, you will see the animals copulate. Okay. The male will do push-ups. He will take a bite hold on the nape of the female, on the skin, on the back of her neck. And then they will kind of, if a female rejects the male, she will flip over. This is real common. See a lot of viral videos on YouTube of, Uromastyx getting its belly tickled, but it's just breeding behavior made into a viral moment, which is so stupid. But anyway, so if a female rejects a male, she's going to flip over, and that's fine. They may flip over once or twice and then breed on a third attempt. But much of the time, if I get flipping reactions from the female for the first 5 minutes that she's in with a male, I'll split them apart. Okay. And then what I'm looking for is that moment when I put them together and the male has grabbed onto her, and you will notice the difference when she is receptive and ready to mate and when she's not. Because instead of flipping over or fighting back with the male, when the male bites onto her nape, it's almost as if she'll go into a trance. She'll relax a little bit, she'll hold still, she'll let the male kind of drag her around the cage a little bit, and then she'll arch her tail gently, like the very base of her tail will arch just a little bit. You'll see it. And that will be an encouragement for the male to copulate. They'll connect vents. The male will position his tail underneath the females, and they'll lock vents. And that copulation moment can happen, can last anywhere from as short as a minute or two, all the way to 10, 12 minutes of staying copulated, okay? I have noticed no correlation between fertility rates, whether it was a fast or a prolonged copulatory moment for the animals, okay? I also have not noticed any change in fertility in the eggs, in the resulting eggs, if I let them copulate a single time through introduction, or if they copulate many times through introduction. Okay, so I have in recent years capped myself. I'll put the animals together 1 to 3 times maximum. Let them get their copulations in, and then that's enough. That's plenty. So then what I do is once the animals have copulated, I note the date and the pair, so I know who mated with who and all of that good stuff, and when they mated. You want to know when they mated, so that way you can plan accordingly for when they're going to lay eggs. All right, so female Uromastyx will gestate anywhere from copulation to egg laying. It'll last anywhere from as few as 5 weeks to as many as 8 weeks without complication. Okay, it just depends a little bit on the individual animal and the species. Some have, like for example, Princeps and Tomasi have have a slightly shorter gestation. They'll lay their eggs sooner, and then some of the larger species like Moroccans, Egyptians, they'll have a longer gestation, more in that 6 to 8 week range. Okay. It's not uncommon, from what I've seen, for Uromastyx that have just mated or have recently paired. The females, after mating, they almost go through what to me looks a little bit like almost the morning sickness kind of thing, where they spend a week or so like a little lethargic, a little bit kind of groggy. They don't come out as much. They don't eat as much, and this can be worrying to some. But I've learned to see it as like a pretty typical sign of post-copulatory stuff with Uromastyx. But what I do is I use this time between when they mate and when they lay their eggs. This is when you want to use your time to set up nesting. Okay, so nesting is quite easy. Generally speaking, all you're going to do is you're going to get like a 10-gallon Rubbermaid or Husky tote. You're going to take a 3-inch circle saw and drill a hole in the side, and you're going to take a corrugated tube that they use for the ends of downspouts and gutters, and you're going to plug that tube into the box. And you want to get the tube entrance as high on the box as you can. And generally speaking, 3 inches is okay, but it's a pretty big entrance, so you can get a 2-inch or a smaller entrance. The Uromastyx like tight spaces to get into, so you don't want a huge opening. You don't want the opening at the bottom, because you don't want them just digging and hitting the bottom of the enclosure. Of the nest box. You want the entrance to the nest box going near the lid, so that way they can get in and then dig down. Now, some species, like Uromastyx tomasi, don't seem as readily predisposed to nesting in a box, at least in my experience and in Josh Marquis' experience, he and I work on tomasi together. But all of us, both of us, and many other breeders have had tomasi have success laying in their boxes, but they don't always. So for some species, if they don't seem like they're interested in using the box, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a whole separate nesting bin. So it's usually a 55-gallon Rubbermaid tote filled with a mixture of play sand and topsoil that's moistened, so that way I can compress it, make it firm, and lay stones over the top of it that they can dig under and make burrows to lay their eggs. Inside your nesting box, you want the same thing. You're going to want a mixture of play sand and topsoil. You can use coconut fiber to make the box lighter, so it's not so heavy. Okay. And then what you're going to want to do is, if you're using the nest box, you want to fill it to the brim. That way, when you snap the lid on, it compacts and helps hold together all of that nesting material on the inside. It makes it so the burrow is less likely to collapse, and she's more likely to smoothly and easily lay her eggs. In terms of placement, where you want the nesting in the enclosure, okay? Usually the Euros are going to look for a nesting space that sits in that 88 to 91 degree range. So if you put the nesting box on the cool side, they might not use it. If you put it on the hot side, they might not use it. Usually somewhere right there in the middle of the enclosure, where one end of the box is going to be a little warmer and one end of the nesting box is going to be a little bit cooler. That's going to give them a sufficient amount of choice, and you can reasonably anticipate that they'll lay their eggs easily in there. Let's see. So that's the nesting. You can also, if you put a nesting box in there and they seem like they're digging elsewhere in the enclosure, it's also fine to say, okay, they're digging here in this corner. Let me pile a whole mess of dirt there and cover it with some stones and some structure to see if they then want to dig underneath that and lay their eggs there. That's okay. The goal for you is to give them as much choice as they can want in where and how to lay their eggs. So that way you have the most chance of them just laying their eggs without issue. Okay. So Uromastyx, depending on the species, will lay anywhere from as few as 6 eggs in a clutch, all the way up to as many as in the 30s for some of the large species like Moroccans, or high 20s and low 30s for like very large Moroccans, big Egyptians, what have you. The average for most of my Euros here is in the 12 to 15 range. I do get clutches from 18 to 23 eggs, depending on the species and the size and age of the animal. When the female lays the eggs and you're ready to remove them, the best thing to do is to let her finish, right? So most of the time I see the females digging in their box, and then when they lay their eggs, I see them come out of their box having backfilled a bunch of sand, and they're just sucked out and skinny. They look like an empty bag of marbles. Okay. So, once I know they've laid their eggs, I want to give them a little bit of time to finish burying. It's good for them to get the chance to fill in their nest completely. Then I'll go in and I will remove the eggs for incubation. Okay. So, the way to, there's a pretty common, there's a lot to talk about here when it comes to nesting or to pulling the eggs out. Okay. So the first thing to say is that you don't have to worry about turning the eggs. Okay. So it used to be thought that if you have a reptile egg, there's like a pocket, the egg is laid in this position, the embryo attaches to the top of the egg, and there's an air pocket there. And if you turn the egg, then it can rupture that air pocket and kill the egg. This is not the case with freshly laid Uromastyx eggs. Okay. So you can turn them, move them. It's going to be just fine. You still want to be gentle with them in removal. You don't want to like throw them around or anything, but just you can pull them out. Trust them. They're going to be resilient little puffy eggs. Okay. Good solid eggs are going to feel, they're going to be puffy, white, pinkish, and kind of turgid, which is to say that they feel like they have tension and pressure pushing from the inside out. So almost like a grape. Okay. So when you pick up a good grape, like a nice ripe grape, it feels kind of firm. It has a little bounce to it, like it bounces back. That's what you want in a good Uromastyx egg. If they are flat and deflated, or ruptured, like a half-filled water balloon or something like that, or really, really yellow or covered in sand, and they don't seem kind of whitish and pinkish, well, those are probably going to be bad eggs. Okay. You should try to incubate everything you get, because you never know, but you don't want to take like an obviously not great egg and mix it with the rest of the good clutch, just because it'll encourage mold growth if that egg dies. Right. So, it's also pretty common for people to say, oh, there's like a pinkish red ring on the egg. That means it's fertile. This is also a myth, okay? The way I think about this is the difference between viable and not viable, okay? So you can have an egg that was fertilized, technically, but does not have a viable embryo in it. You can all, so this is this is why I think it's a more apt term, because you can also have eggs that look like they're fertile. They look like they have that ring on there, but it's actually just blood vessels. It's not indicative of any embryo or anything in there. It's just stuff that was growing from mom that's in there. Okay, so I think the better way to think about it, I would not look at a clutch of eggs and think, oh, these are fertile just because they have a pink ring on them, right? I think it's sort of like generally like a bit of a misnomer. I like to wait until the eggs are about 2 weeks into incubation to understand whether or not they are viable or not. Usually 2 weeks, if the eggs are going to croak, oftentimes they do so by 2 weeks. Okay, so now, how do we incubate the eggs? The long and the short of this is to say that there's probably, just like on how to care for these guys, there's probably a lot of different ways that you can successfully successfully incubate Uromastyx eggs. I've seen people incubate on perlite, vermiculite, hatchite, coconut fiber, Repashy super hatch, sim incubation containers. All of them will work, okay? If you have healthy eggs from low stress adults, the range of conditions in which they can incubate and successfully hatch is rather high. So this is going to look like a very wide range of temperatures from as low as 82 to as high as 93, maybe even a little higher. My personal preference is to incubate my eggs at 88 degrees. That's what I like. But I spent years incubating at 92, years incubating at 90, 91. It's all good. You'll get hatching at all those different temperatures, okay? The incubation medium, people ask me, like, what's your humidity? How do you measure the humidity? And it's like, at this point, I go by feel. So the way I set up my incubation containers now is I use perlite and I mix it with just a tiny bit of activated charcoal to help with mold prevention and add more minerals into the incubation medium. And I mix it with water. It used to be that I would do, it was a 1-to-1 ratio of perlite to water by weight. This is what I used to do. Now, again, I'm going mostly by feel, so I know how moist the bedding ought to be. So I just aim for that and I mix it by hand. Then I have that in a nice incubation, like a deli, like a Ziploc container that's just big enough to house the eggs with a little bit of perlite in it. And then I'll put a ventilation hole on either side. But for the first month of incubation, I will have tape over those holes. I'll put painter's tape over the holes to hold in the moisture. Okay. And sometimes I forget to take that tape off and they hatch just fine. Sometimes I take the tape off early and they hatch just fine. I've had no ventilation holes in the way, sort of like you would do with a sim suspended incubation container. That's worked just fine. I've had very high ventilation where I'm adding moisture in all the time. That works just fine. Good healthy eggs will stay puffy and blow up a little bit. They'll actually grow in size as they incubate. Eggs that are going to fail are going to turn weird colors. They're going to get oozy and gross and slimy. They're going to mold. They're going to collapse. Okay. It is okay if a little bit of denting happens in the eggs. It may just mean that you need to add a little bit of moisture to the substrate, but don't overdo it. It's always easier to add moisture to the bedding in an incubation container than it is to take it away. So you always start on a little bit drier side if you want, and then add moisture as needed. If you're getting just a little bit of denting, you might need to add moisture. If you add a little bit of moisture, sometimes they'll reinflate and you'll be fine. Sometimes you'll add a little bit of moisture and the egg will stay somewhat dented. That's okay. I've had eggs that are relatively collapsed, still hatch just fine, healthy babies. It's not necessarily the end of the world, okay? So we've talked about temperature. We've talked about substrate. Let's talk about mold for a second. So it's pretty common that people worry about mold because the idea is that the mold is going to kill the eggs. And I understand that sometimes there are molds that are virulent enough to cause egg death. But much of the time, healthy Euro eggs are very resilient to fungal growth. And if the egg is molding, it's we mistakenly think of it as the cause of the egg dying, when in reality it's actually a symptom of the egg already not being viable. So this is something I think is really important, because I've had a lot of clients and customers who got eggs that molded, and they thought that, oh, the mold killed the eggs, and they thought that they had to change something about their incubation, but it's actually not that. It was some other upstream issue that was happening, like they were keeping their animals together and not housed alone or whatever it is. So don't freak out about mold is the basic thing here. Let's see. So we've done temperature, we've done mold, we've done moisture. Let's get to, candling. Let's talk about candling really quick. I don't think we should candle our eggs. Okay. I don't think it's necessary. You don't need to check to see if they're fertile or developing. I think that the light is really unnatural and might not be good for the little developing embryos. I'm sure it's fine for them with some, but for some species, I think it might be bad. It might be bad to do. So I don't like to candle, because the eggs tell you from the outside most of the time whether or not they're good or not. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, just by looking at them, the eggs look good. They look great. They should hatch. Okay, so I don't like candling eggs. I don't recommend anybody do it. You can pull eggs that are going foul. So if the eggs are clearly dying, collapsing, getting slimy, like getting really bad, I would encourage you to pull those out and separate them from your other eggs. But you can keep them in another container, because they might stay and incubate. They might still hatch, but maybe you just separate them anyway. It helps keep the smell down, and helps make it less likely that if there is a virulent mold thing that's going to kill the eggs, then it's not going to get to the others, right? You can also use a little bit of antifungal spray. You can spray the eggs with a little bit of an antifungal spray. I've had that work. I've heard of that working. I have had eggs that have had a toenail puncture from the female that are still turgid, that developed like a little bit of mold at the opening. I have put an antifungal cream on that little opening, and it's sealed and killed the mold, and the babies have hatched. So you can do that as well. And then now so usually incubation duration, depending on the temperature and the species, you're going to see a range from about as few as 55 days, which is really, really fast, but it has happened, all the way to like 90 plus. Okay. So, but the average is going to fall in that 65 to 75 days from egg laying to hatching. Most of the babies will emerge within 24 to 48 hours of each other, but not always. And then, but it can take up to a week or more before all of them hatch. Generally speaking, the care for babies is almost identical to that of adults. It's just on a small scale. I start all of my babies on paper towel, only because it's easier for me to clean when I have large numbers of them. But you can start babies on gravel and sand. It's just fine. I've done it hundreds of times. It's no problem. It's not going to hurt them. It's just easier to manage and clean when you do it this way for me. Let's see. Then the only other difference is that baby Uromastyx, in order to inoculate their gut with good bacteria that helps them break down cellulose, which is really common in herbivores, they will seek out and consume the feces of adult animals of their same species. So you can do this with the parents of the animals that you hatched. You can do this. What I do is I actually take adult poo from all around the facility and spread it among the babies. So like if it's an ornate clutch of Uromastyx that hatched, I'll take dried pellets from 5 or 6 different adult pens, crumble it all up, mix it with a little bit of calcium and multivitamin, and put it in a bowl. And you will see the babies come over and they will eat it and consume it readily. It's very good for them. This is very important. It's a great practice. It's so funny. It's kind of gross, but it's a thing. This is what you want to do. This is going to be a great way to get them started. And you can do it once. You can do it for a couple of months after they hatch. I have done all of that and everything in between. And I haven't noticed the major difference between the ones that I only did it for once and the ones that got lots of different, for like a month or two, lots of different types of feces for a month or two. So I don't think there's a huge thing there. But other than that, there's not really much difference between the babies and the adults. I might offer some of the babies a little bit more in the way of calcium and multivitamin supplementation. I might offer them a little bit more in the way of insect feeding. So still not a lot. It still makes up less than 5% of their diet, but I do it more frequently with a baby than I would with an adult. And you have to be very careful. Some species, like the real small ones, like Ocelota, Thomasi, Princeps, you probably want to avoid giving them large amounts of dry food until they're larger. Okay, so I like to keep things like the seed mixes and lentils and whatnot like this much more minimal for those small species as babies until they get to be larger individuals later in life. The other thing that's worth noting here is that baby Uromastyx can be very aggressive with one another. Okay, so I've seen territorial behavior start from the day they come out of the egg. I see little baby Thomasi head bobbing at one another. So you have to be very careful in mitigating hatchling aggression, because the aggression from one hatchling to the rest of the clutch can cause the rest of that clutch to stress out and go downhill very quickly. So you'll want to split out the worst offenders when it escalates to a point of chasing and biting. You want to pull them out. You can also see this by little diamond-shaped marks on the sides and flanks of babies, which are bite marks from more aggressive siblings from fighting. So it's great to split out individuals that are especially aggressive with one another. All right. So that's the crux of breeding. Let's get into, let's talk a little bit briefly about wild plants. So this is something that's pretty important to me. Generally, if I have the choice between a wild weed that is suggested as a moderate food item, if I have a choice between that plant and a produce store-bought staple, I will choose the wild counterpart, even if it's a feed in moderation type food, every time over the store-bought version. Okay, wild weeds and foods, when you can get them, if you have access to them, are going to be a very, very important lever that you can play with for the health and well-being and long-term cognitive well-being of your animals. It's just gonna be good for them, period. Okay, so dandelion greens, common mallow, globe mallow, bindweed, black medic, common knotgrass, broadleaf plantain, wild alfalfa, clover. All of these plants are excellent wild weed alternative food choices that grow invasively all over the United States, as far as I'm aware, at varying times of year. So I find this stuff very, very useful and really good to give them. It will save you money. It's more nutritionally complete for the animals. It's good to give them the variation in their diet and the enrichment of feeding on a real plant that they get to pull apart themselves. This is just great for them. So I wanted to make sure I touch on that, and something that I want people to use. There are excellent apps that you can get for your phone that have plant identification apps, and then apps that will tell you, like the tortoise table is so Plantum is an app that is a plant identification app. I use it all the time. And then the tortoise table is a great general reference for whether or not the plant that you've just identified with Plantum is suitable to feed your animal. Now, Uromastyx and tortoises are not identical, but we have a lot more information about what is good and bad for tortoises than we do for generally what is good and bad for Uromastyx. So even though I don't use the tortoise table as I don't treat it as gospel, it's a great way of helping me understand whether or not I might be cautious with feeding something or not. Okay, so those are two great apps to get. That will be helpful. Okay, I'm going to take the time to get into some of the questions that people have asked me when I announced that I was going to do this podcast. I decided to pose questions, to get my listeners and followers to sort of pose questions to me about that they'd like to hear me discuss on this particular episode. So I'm just going to start and get right into those. So one of them was, what are the three things that I wish everyone knew about Uromastyx? For me, the big ones is one, that they are best housed alone. That's huge. I think this is an underrated and important aspect of what I think will make someone successful in keeping Uromastyx is to keep them alone. The second thing is they are not strict vegans. This is something that it goes around all the time. People think that the animals are just absolute strict herbivores. But there almost is no such thing in the wild as a completely strict carnivore and a 100% strict herbivore. They all have even a minor amount of overlap in the middle, whether it's a lion ingesting the gut of a gazelle that has all this plant matter in it, or if it's a Uromastyx eating a beetle that they found in the dry season, right? So I think having this is an important thing. I don't think we should be dogmatic in one direction or the other, and we should be open-minded to the ways that Uromastyx in the wild, based on season and all kinds of other factors, might be more prone to eating insects than we give them credit for. And then the third thing rather, that I wish people knew about Uromastyx, I'm going to split this one. So for people who already have a Uromastyx, I wish that they knew that they don't have to mess with them when they shed. Your animals will take a long time to shed. It's normal for Uromastyx to take a while to shed, and you don't have to mess with them at all. But then if it's for someone who doesn't have a Uromastyx, I think the third thing that I would say is that you don't realize how incredibly colorful they can be when you've given them a couple of years of excellent care and peak resources. Every single Uromastyx I've ever seen, you give them proper care and they will become a absolutely beautiful adult. So I think that's one thing. One is, someone asked about what the biggest hurdles in my Euro work has been. One that I've discussed before but haven't recently is, in the first year that I decided to scale up my operation from a simple hobby breeding practice to something that was a little bit larger and more business oriented. That very next season, it was just awful. I got about 95 eggs from all the pairs I was working with, and I only hatched about 20, and it was brutal. I watched so many eggs, so many species breed, lay eggs, and then the eggs die after 2 weeks in incubation. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I thought it made me think that I had made the wrong decision in scaling up. It made me think that I was foolish for thinking I could breed all the species that I eventually bred. It was really hard and painful. That was a big hurdle. Another really big hurdle is I had a disgruntled competitor. Funnily enough, didn't even have anything to do with Euros. I was working with another genus of lizards, with collared lizards, not the Calaris, but the Baja collared lizards and Bicingtories and some of these others. And I had a disgruntled competitor call Colorado Fish and Game on me. Then he claimed that I was breeding and selling illegal reptiles, which I wasn't, of course. Never have, never will. But they came over and indicated to me that maybe I needed to do this in like a proper business space. And it kind of scared me. I thought that they might kind of have their eye on me, and it kind of made me uncomfortable. I know now that sometimes this is just part and parcel of working in the exotic industry. You kind of brush up against the authorities sometimes, even when you're doing the right thing. And so I decided at that time to move my operation from the basement of my family home into a 2,000 square foot flex warehouse. And that was a terrifying leap, because I went from having very little overhead to having a lot of overhead. And I had never done that before, and it was very frightening. So that was really scary. There haven't been other huge major hurdles, like, frankly, I'd say maybe one of the other hurdles it's been really, really hard to meet the demand, right? Uromastyx are in high demand, and it's been hard to produce enough animals to meet that demand. I do a very good job. I produce anywhere from 200 to 300 Uromastyx every year, and I'm really proud of that number, but I think it could be more. So, it's been hard to meet the demand. Let's see. And then one other would be that part of what I try to offer through the work that I do is like access to help. I'm trying to help people. I want all of you who are listening to this to be able to do this yourself and to be able to breed your Euros or successfully care for your animals or whatever it is, even if it's not just Euros. And it's hard to do that as one person. It's difficult to do that as a single individual who's also trying to maintain a healthy work-life balance. So that can be a hurdle sometimes. But the good thing is it's work that I love. Someone asked how my philosophy, my herpetocultural or Euro philosophy has changed over the years. Um, I used to think that the keeping them solo part of what I do was primarily the result of a quirk about the way I do it and the way I care for them. But now I feel more and more like this is actually something that's rather core to Euros and is something that I try to encourage other people to do. And I've just put a lot more time into emphasizing just the mental well-being of my animals over the years. It's just something that's so important to me, and I think boredom is one of the biggest unsolved problems. We levy like a huge boredom tax on reptiles when we're not paying attention to their needs and the demands of their psyche, right? One person asked, what would make Uromastyx more popular? Okay, so one is I think just more people keeping and spreading information about Euros is going to make them more popular. That's one thing. I think an increased availability in truly captive bred animals. So one way to think about this would be if myself and or other breeders scaled up their operations sufficiently so, I think it would help make them more popular, because if they're more available, if there's more access to them at a more beginner-friendly price point, then I think that would be really good for them. So oddly enough, one of my goals is to produce enough animals to where I can lower the price and lower the barrier for entry at some point. But that's one thing. And then I think additionally is I think more people showing off excellent work, I think, is just going to continue to help make them more popular. Okay, so let's see. All right, so sorry, y'all. I had to pause it for just a moment, use the restroom. Believe I left off on what would make Euros more popular. So what I wanted to get to next was just some notes on some of the different species. Okay, so just getting into some of the pros and cons and the sort of the current state of each of these species, specifically with regard to the United States trade. So I'm going to start with some of the larger ones. Personally, I no longer breed Egyptian Uromastyx. I made the decision to say that they're not necessarily the most ethical species to produce anymore, just due to their very large size. It is so difficult to provide a proper temperature gradient as well as proper basking area for such a large Euro. So I have just decided that the Egyptians, both Uromastyx aegyptia and aegyptia microlepis, are probably too big for the average person to keep. Doesn't mean people shouldn't keep them, of course. I just mean that it doesn't necessarily work for what I'm doing here. But I also think they're just exceptionally difficult to provide for. So I think maybe I would discourage people from producing those. Just let them be in the wild. Let's see. So then you have your Moroccan, banded, and Mali Uromastyx. Okay, so they're beautiful. The Malis are super, super variable with beautiful yellow and black and honeycomb patterning. The Moroccans come in either lime, orange, or bicolor, and then your bandeds, the Flavofasciata, come in. They're black. They're banded, and the bands can either be it's black and white, black and yellow, or black and orange. They're great. These species are beautiful. They're all excellent, very robust, slightly less climbing inclined compared to some of the other ones. A little more flat ground, burrow-dwelling individuals that probably come from slightly harsher environments in terms of the extremes of both heat and cold, and feast and famine. Unfortunately, those three species, they're very aggressive with one another, and the offspring are also extremely aggressive with one another. Really, really vicious. So I think these animals, maybe are a harder project for people. They're also going to be, they're going to suffer from the notable issue of having a relatively small or a relatively few founding population here in the United States, unless more get imported at some point in the future. I don't see that happening. All Euros are CITES 2 at least, and it's just unlikely that we're going to see any more of them come in. We might get the odd straggler shipment here and there, but I would place a relatively high wager that in the next 10 to 20 years, they're just going to not be imported anymore at all from anywhere. Not just those species, but all Euros. Okay. Now I want to talk. I want to get in a little bit to. Let's talk about Uromastyx princeps. Excellent animals. I produced them, hundreds of them for a long time. Wonderful, but again, very low founding population. Very robust, very resilient, small little animals. Not the most colorful, sort of like the Egyptians. They're beautiful. They can have great color sometimes, but just not most colorful on average, and not very friendly on average. Princeps are bird-like in some ways. They're very alert, very aware, very flighty, and I don't think that they're the best pet examples in Uromastyx. We have Uromastyx yemenensis, which are another beautiful. This is the Yemeni Uromastyx. Really only had maybe one or two importations of these into the United States, three tops over 50 years. And it's very unlikely that these will be seen into the future, except in small numbers. There are a handful of people with small founding populations. I think they could do well with these animals. Yemenensis are not always the best pets on average. They also tend towards the shy side. I don't think that's a huge deal. I think there's always going to be like a nice, interesting market for Uromastyx yemenensis, but they just probably won't be a big, like high number animal. Uromastyx filbii or not a filbii. This is another one that for a long time I argued that they didn't have a sufficient founding population to sustain long term in herpetoculture, but then a random import group was brought in, I think last year before, 2023, 2024, one of the two. And that brought in a huge number of adults that hopefully, if they ended up in any good breeding homes, will help spread out more diversity, genetically speaking, across the filbii population. But that's yet to be seen. Filbii are also interesting in that they're beautiful, but they're sort of relatively, at least within the United States, there's relatively limited variability. I think that's true in filbii, yemenensis, princeps, Mali, and banded. Well, maybe not the banded, but in Mali's. So all of those that I just listed, I think, they're not as variable. The adult forms of each of those are a little more uniform and have less variety. There's great variety. They're beautiful animals. This is not meant to be a dig on the animals at all. It's just a description, okay? Getting into Thomasi, I think Uromastyx Thomasi are, maybe not yet, but eventually might be better for a beginner. But right now, I still think they're kind of in that moderate to experienced level keeper status. Beautiful animals, rare, likely to be a low founding population animal as well. So their broad long-term viability going forward in herpetoculture is questionable. I think this is true of all Uromastyx, with the exception of ornate and J-Rye. But we really want to make sure that we can get as many. This has been the case since I got into keeping Euros 30 years ago. Not 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Yeah. So it's like they've always been difficult to get, and there's always been like a relatively small number of people producing them in any numbers and with any diversity, right? So this is not specific to these species necessarily. This is just broader trends around Uromastyx in general that have found their way into the individual species sector. Okay, so in my opinion, the two most viable long-term species going forward are ornates and J-Rye. So Uromastyx ornata and Uromastyx J-Rye, or Gayri, depending on your pronunciation. Those two species have the best track record in terms of their consistency and being forgiving enough to beginner error to be accessible to the largest number of people. They each within them have enough variety and enough diversity, both in terms of looks. So when I say not that much variety. I'm referring to the physical appearance. They tend to be, there's some that tend to be relatively uniform and all look rather similar. And then there's some that, like the Uromastyx ornata, which are just all so different. Every one of them is so different and so unique and so special, right? So these animals, I think, Uromastyx ornata and JRI are the ones that I would describe as probably the two premier species of Uromastyx that I think have the highest chance of being long-term viable in herpetoculture. Then I wanted to briefly just touch on some of the Sara species. So I keep Sara hardwickii. I have never kept Loricata or Asmusi. And there are no Asmusi in the United States. There are a handful of individual Loricata scattered across maybe 3 or 4 households that I'm aware of, but none of them in viable breeding pairs or groups, sadly. So, and it's unlikely that we'll see those in the country. Not impossible, but unlikely that we'll see them in the future. So, I can't speak much to Loricata or Asmusi, but the hardwickii I can say are excellent animals, and they may have a future in U.S. herpetoculture, but that is sort of yet to be seen. No one. They were only imported I think at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025. That was the first time they were imported in the United States in about 20 plus years. And so in that time, we probably have no examples of anybody breeding them in that time so hopefully with this most recent shipment, hopefully enough of them made it to breeding homes to where they're going to be viable, long term. But that'll be yet to be seen. I'm expecting mine to breed in 2026, but we will see. So I had one person asking about species-specific tweaks. So there's a few ways we can break this down. The first is probably going to be climbing features, right? So your Yemenensis, your Ornata, your Filbii, your Ocellata, your Princeps. These animals, I think, are going to be much, much better climbers overall. So you're going to want to prioritize more climbing space, both in terms of height and in terms of features higher up for those species. For ones like Thomasi, Bandids, Moroccans, Mollies, JRI, less climbing because they're less apt to do so. They're going to be more ground dwelling, a little bit flatter, might spend some time on boulders and rocks, of course, but they're not exactly climbers in the same way that those other species are. There are some species that probably have higher openness to insects in the diet, and this is mostly based on wild data. So some of the Sara species, like even the Sara hardwickii, I've got a great photo that I found on iNaturalist of one eating a scorpion. So, I mean, surely, obviously, they're eating some insects in the wild, and in terms of what numbers and how much and how often, that's sort of yet to be seen there. But I think, you can also look at, for example, there are a couple of studies that cite, field studies that cite Uromastyx aegyptia potentially feeding on carrion and finding feathers in their stool and in their gut. Also, there were some that were brought into some kind of lab or indoor condition in that same study, and they ate eggs, like scrambled, hard-boiled eggs or whatever. There were bones, that were found in the feces. So some of this stuff, there's probably going to be some like those that, depending on the season and depending on exactly what you're offering, are going to be more open to let's say some insect food, right? There's let's see, why would hang on, sorry, I'm looking at my list of questions here. I want to make sure I cover all of the people who asked me things. So, inbreeding and with limited founding animals. This is a very interesting topic. So, let me just start by saying nobody really knows what this, there's no real good way to know how tolerant certain species will be to inbreeding, how detrimental that is going to be long term over the course of a history with those animals. How often you would need to add in outcrossing or new blood. I mean, it's all kind of up in the air with all of this stuff. There's some guiding ideas that we know. Obviously, we probably want to minimize inbreeding as best we can and increase diversity. I think that's always a good general guiding principle. But but the reality is, if you have a species that we're all going to want around and we'd like to keep going, that there's probably like a limited lifespan for some of these. Like maybe they won't be able to be here for 500 years into the future, but at least for the next 100 years, there's no reason they can't be here in the minimal breeding numbers that we're doing. So I think it's hard to give like a hard guidance on that. I just think that probably generally just avoiding inbreeding in general, except when you're doing it for specific reasons and it's very, very short term, it's probably good to dodge it. I had one person ask about wild burrows and if they might just be for temperature regulation and maybe not needed in captive settings. That's a very interesting question. I think there's a couple of ways to answer it. I would say first that I think if there's a feature of their life in the wild, we should probably do our best to replicate it in captivity. Obviously, we have to draw limits in some of these places, and I don't provide burrows, large burrows for my animals. They don't get large or long, deep burrows. They get short, small hides that function as burrows. I still try to make them as much like a burrow as I can. Stable temperature, stable humidity, whatever, right? So I think that's great to do. But the burrows aren't just for temperature, right? They're for they're for thermoregulation, but they're also shelter from predators, shelter from the elements, moisture buffering. There's probably lots of different reasons why burrows happen, not just for temperature. Let's see. There was someone who asked about when do you make a decision to stop incubating eggs? Like when do you decide, all right, this egg's done? So for me, I'm using both smell as a judgment. Like if they reek, they'll smell like death if they're dead. So that's a great one. That's a great time to do it. The other is if they are hard. So when they collapse and they get rigid and rigor mortis, you'll know because they get super hard. And at that point, the eggs certainly not going to hatch anymore. So that's when I will usually take those eggs out. Yeah. So let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit about talking about like thinking more about agency than aesthetic. Okay. So the reason I want to mention this is because I think that it's very easy to become aesthetic focused. And what I mean by that is how the animal and the cage, how all of it looks all the time, right? Like wanting it to be beautiful always, or always wanting it to have the perfect color or great color, the animal always being at its peak colors. The reality is this is just not the way it is. Sometimes the animals are very peak temperature and excited and at their brightest colorations. And sometimes they're colder and a little more lethargic and slow. And sometimes they're dark. And sometimes the enclosure gets dirty. And sometimes you have to, there's all this stuff. I think it's really important to think less about how the enclosure looks all the time, even though you don't want to ignore that, but think more about how the way your enclosure and the lifestyle you've set up for your animal is more reflective of giving them agency. It's giving them lots of opportunity and choice, lots of opportunity for movement, lots of opportunity for shelter, lots of opportunity for novelty. Okay, I think this is super important, not just for Uromastyx, but for reptiles and amphibians as a whole. Let's see. Someone asked, why are Uromastyx thomasi challenging? So this is a great one. I think that this is broadly true. When I first started working with thomasi and breeding them, I did not agree with this statement. I thought they were relatively easy. But I've noticed I've been breeding thomasi for like 15 years now, and it's pretty clear that they just don't have the same success rate in other homes that a lot of Euros might. And I think that much of this is related to they might just be a smaller, more sensitive species. Like they just might not have the same level of resilience that these other species have. I think some of it could be, we don't know this for sure, but there weren't that many animals that were originally brought in terms of founding Uromastyx thomasi, both in the United States and in Europe. And so it could be that there's limited genetic diversity within thomasi. We don't really know unless we were able to get some sort of test done for that. I think, so sometime in the next couple of weeks, myself and Josh Marquis, who we work together on our Uromastyx thomasi projects and have for a long time, we've recently found out that, so in the next couple of weeks, we're going to do a podcast to talk about this, but we've recently found out that some small Uromastyx thomasai, some babies can get what's called hard belly. That's what we call hard belly anyway. And it is a retained egg yolk in the abdomen that causes death, basically. And this is a really, really interesting topic. Josh and I have been working on this and trying to get at it for years, and we really finally got some great results this year in terms of getting more information. So keep your eyes out for that podcast where we will go into that in at length, because it's whole own separate story that we really want to tell, and I think will be really interesting to people. So that's going to be a whole thing. So keep your eyes out for that. But I think this is basically what makes thomasai more challenging on this. Some combination of all of these factors are probably the thing that makes thomasai a little extra challenging to the average person. So one person asked, roughage. Do Uromastyx benefit from roughage? So roughage is basically the term given to a consumed object that acts as roughage. In other words, grinds against. It's either going to, like, for example, chickens will eat rocks and it helps break up the food and helps like pass through. It'll get minerals from it. It helps pull parasites from the edges of the gut lining as the little tiny chunks of stone like pass through the digestive system. It's roughage is multifaceted, right? So this is what roughage is. And I think that this is probably a feature of many wild animals. This has got to be a feature of lots of different wild animals, specifically wild reptile diets. And with Uromastyx in the wild, they have very high, the fecal analysis of wild animals show lots of seed and stone, small pieces of little grit alongside their regular plant matter, which supports mechanical processing, and it supports the idea of there being seed dispersers, being ground-dwelling herbivores. I think that this is probably, surely roughage is gonna benefit them in captivity, but it's not like mineral grit or forced grit that you would give to birds. It's not the same thing. I wouldn't suggest feeding Euros rocks or something like that, right? So it's just worth discussing there. Let's see. Another thing, shedding help, right? So this has come up at least once in this conversation, but just to reiterate here, in 99% of cases, you don't need to help your animal shedding at all, okay? It is totally okay to occasionally have, maybe you have an animal that is sick and has a fungal infection, right? It's been diagnosed by a vet. Or perhaps there's a physical injury and a scarring that can make it so the shed doesn't always come off as it ought to. In those cases, yes, some minor assistance would be fine. But generally speaking, most people will never, ever have to help their animal shed. They do it all on their own. So let's see. Falls. This is a great question. How high can these animals fall from and it be safe? This is a tough one to answer. There's probably there's no data on this, right? But we have to remember that most of these lizards in the wild are living on very large rock piles or cliff sides and big rock sides, right? So surely falls happen from time to time. I think it's worth noting that, like, when they fall in their natural habitat, they probably have lots of natural ways of arresting the fall or making it less impactful. And they might not have the reactions might not have that same effect inside an artificial environment. So consider how high they're falling from, how they land. If they hit their head, that's probably going to be a lot worse. If they fall on carpet versus if they fall on concrete. I tend to err on the side of Uromastyx being very resilient, and that they could probably tolerate a lot of abuse, not literal abuse, but like accident, just as an accidental term for trauma. Like they can, they could fall, something could happen. And of course, like, I think they'd be fine. So, you just want to be careful with them all the time. You don't want to have like an 8-foot cage and have it possible that your baby Uromastyx thomasai can fall from 8 feet onto the rock floor. You know what I mean? That probably wouldn't be good. But like a couple of feet fall is probably not going to hurt them at all. Let's see. Minimum breeding age. Okay, this is a very, very interesting one. There's only one more topic after this that I'll cover, and then we'll close this bad boy out. But these last two are really interesting. So minimum breeding age. I love talking about this. This is really, really variable. In some species, people will give a base gram weight for when it's sort of minimum size for breeding. I don't have that for any Uromastyx, whether it be the ones that I have worked with forever or the ones that I've only just started working with. The maximum size for all of these animals is such that you could get, and their growth rate means that you could have an animal that might need to wait until it's 5 to breed and one that could breed at 3 years old. I find that at minimum 3 years has to be hit before breeding is going to be doable. And this just seems to be like the minimum size at which they'll even cycle to breed, okay? For females, that is. Males can breed quite small. I've had yearling males, father clutches with older females. But young females, it's better just to let them get large, right? You don't want them breeding super young. If you breed them too young, it will probably shorten their breeding lifespan. If you do it a little too much too early. Although I would also argue that generally speaking, if with regard to these animals, if they're old, if they can produce eggs, then it's probably okay for them to do so. Like it's not gonna. It would be difficult. I don't think we have removed them sufficiently from their wild counterparts to influence how early they breed just yet. I might change my mind on that in the future. But anyway, regardless, the idea would still be wait for at least 3 years, no matter what species you have. And that only means, and that is only in the context of a very rapid growth rate. If you want to be super, super safe, wait 4 or 5 years for any species of, Uromastyx until you breed them. So the closing segment that I want to end with here is I want to talk about the sort of this three-way topic of morphs, hybridization, and the future. Okay, so let me lay out a few things here before I get into this. I feel like the future of Uromastyx in the US has, if I was going to put money on it, I think in 50 years' time, we're mostly going to see ornates, J-Rye, and we might see a handful of other species floating around the trade, but in very small numbers. I think that's best case scenario. I think worst case scenario, only one species like ornate or J-Rye ends up becoming popular enough to sustain long-term in herpetoculture. We don't really have a good understanding. There's no framework, there's no data, there's no whatever to help any of us determine and make good predictions about what the future of U.S. herpetoculture might look like. So all of what I'm saying right now is pure speculation and just imagination on my part. I think the future of Uromastyx herpetoculture in the United States has a place for morphs. There are already a handful of morphs that exist, and I'll go over those in a few. And I also think there's a chance that in the future there may be hybrids of some kind. I don't ever have intentions right now of making hybrids in my animals. I've played with the idea in the past, but I don't. Not for any particular reason. I don't think there's anything unethical about hybrids. The topic of hybridization as a whole is not something I want to, not just generally speaking, it's not something I'm trying to, I'm not taking a hard position on whether or not one ought or ought not to create hybrids. I'm very open-minded this topic, very agnostic to what the right answer might be, and if there even is one. But I just think that there's a non-zero possibility that someone at some point might prefer hybrid Euros if they ever make them. Some of them will surely hybridize with one another. And I think we should be open-minded to what that looks like. I don't think it's a horrible thing. I love the idea of keeping some of my species as pure as possible and as whatever pure means, and keeping them as reminiscent of the wild thing to a degree. But I also think that, progress is progress. And unfortunately, no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try to keep them looking like their wild counterparts, we will inevitably change these animals. So I think embracing it and saying that some of that change should be directed in a way that makes their lives better is probably a good thing. So with that said, there are morphs, right? So we have in Uromastyx J-Rye, we have the lavender albino, which was proven and developed by Josh Marquis. This started with a wild individual that was imported, a young female. She was like a juvenile size. And Josh bought her, raised her, bred her, proved out the gene, and is now refining it. And he's done a great job with it. It's a great. I have some. I have a lavender albino male and a het female that I'll be breeding this year in 2026. There's also the hypo-ornate from Scott Wilson, which was first produced by Audrey Vanderlinden back in the day, and then Scott took up her animals when she got out of the Euro hobby, and he was able to produce more of it and sort of secondarily prove it out over the last like 8 years or so, 8, 9 years. And those animals are really interesting looking, kind of a cool novelty. They, it's sort of a drag. Some of them, they have a little bit, it has a tendency to kind of pull some of the color out of them. They're still super unique looking, and it's a really cool mutation, but they don't have the some of the same sort of curb appeal, you might say, of like a wild ornate. But they're a beautiful, interesting project. So kudos to Scott for doing that good work. And then there is a let's see, there's the patternless Molly Uromastyx produced by Nick Alexander. This was just a random fluke that he bred a pair of Molly Uromastyx, and when they hatched, a bunch of the babies were patternless, which is super interesting. The Molly Uromastyx, again, is a very rare and not high. There's very few of those animals in U.S. herpetoculture at the moment, and so it's sort of tough to say what the sort of the future of Molly Uromastyx as a whole have in the United States. But all that said, that particular mutation is super interesting and really unique to see. And Nick's done a good job sort of growing those ones out and showing what those animals look like. So, keep your eyes open for those. And there are going to be others. I can say there's more than one that I'm myself and others are working on to try to see if they're real, or if they're a trait, or if they're a fluke, or if they're something genetic. So that's extremely interesting. I think the future of any animal that spends enough time in herpetoculture, I think morphs are just going to be a part of the picture in the future, and that's okay. You can have your morphs and you can have your wild types, and they can coexist, and you don't have to prefer one to the other. You can pick whichever you like, and I think that's great. So I think that the future looks very bright for Uromastyx. These are a wonderful, wonderful pet lizard that has so much potential. They have so much personality, so much variety. And, when you think about them, they're a low maintenance pet. They live a long time. They don't eat a whole lot of food. They're very easy to upkeep and maintain. You can go away for a week-long vacation and leave the animals, and they will be just fine. There's so much there. So I really hope that listening to this particular episode has given you useful information, and information that you can use to do better, not just with your animals, but hopefully for others who might be brand new to this, who might be able to use this to kind of find their way into Uromastyx. So thank you all for listening, and thanks for the support in what I do. Please let me know if I've missed anything or messed up in this in this particular. I've never done like a solo recording of this kind of thing before, so I hope I didn't miss anything. I put a lot of preparation into this, and I hope y'all liked it. So thank you.